I move on to the genre of wisdom psalms. Wisdom psalms are part of the wisdom literature generally, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and they're psalms that give guidance to how to live life. Very often they'll echo the language of books like Psalms. So, for example, the book of Psalms actually begins with a wisdom psalm, Psalm 1, book 1, Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, or stands in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so. They are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Now, Psalm 1 is an example, and notice how it picks up language of psalms like scoffer and counsel, and sometimes it'll use the word wisdom. But anyway, Psalm 1 is an example of a wisdom psalm. Psalm 19 is an example of a wisdom psalm. Psalm 119, the longest of the psalms, is yet another example of a wisdom psalm. Yet another category is a psalm of confidence or a psalm of trust. A psalm of confidence or a psalm of trust is a psalm that exalts in the psalmist's faith or trust or confidence in God. Psalm 23 is a good example of a psalm of confidence, especially the line, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of deep darkness, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me," or you are with me. Now, Gunkel actually categorized these as laments, but they don't really have the feel of a lament, and therefore scholars since Gunkel has categorized them differently than laments. A lament has more of a mood of despair, but Psalm 23 has no despair. Come what may, the psalmist says, deep dark valley or what, the Lord is with me, and I do not fear. But anyway, Psalms of confidence include Psalms 4, Psalm 11, Psalm 16, Psalm 23, Psalm 27, 62, 91, 121, 125, and 131. The last category we'll talk about are messianic psalms. Messianic psalms are psalms that emphasize the human king, the Davidic king of Judah and before that Israel, and the king's relationship with God. And these psalms are especially precious to Christians because we find the ultimate fulfillment of them in Jesus Christ. And there are a number of examples. Psalm 2 we've talked about before. It's a coronation psalm for crowning the new king of Judah. And it celebrates the promise of 2 Samuel 7:14 that the Davidic king would have a father-son relationship with God. And so it makes that statement, "I'll tell you the decree of the Lord. He has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you." Now, this father-son relationship was partially fulfilled in the special relationship with God that all the Davidic kings had, but it's only fully fulfilled in Jesus, and certainly the ends of the earth being the Davidic king's possession is only fulfilled in Christ. Others include Psalm 18, Psalm 20, Psalm 45, Psalm 72, 101, 110, and 132. I'll give you a little bit of a taste of some of this. For example, Psalm 45 is a royal wedding psalm. Basically, when a king of Judah married, you're handsome, most handsome of the sons of men. Grace is poured out on your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh. And then it goes on to talk about the bride. Hear, O daughter, and consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house. And the king will desire your beauty, since he is your Lord. And the people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, and so on and so forth. This psalm was originally used for the marriage of Davidic kings, though the language of it, again, is only fulfilled fully in Jesus Christ. When it speaks of the king, it says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Scepter of your kingdom is the scepter of uprightness." Well, it's a little bit odd calling the king God. "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." The book of Hebrews remarks on this, that only Jesus really fulfills this literally. Now, the king was God in the sense that he ruled on God's throne and he ruled for God, but calling him God is a little bit risque, but it perfectly anticipates the ultimate Davidic king, Jesus, who is God in an unqualified sense. And as we might apply this to Christ, we would apply it to the royal wedding, the marriage supper of the Lamb, where the church will be his bride at the second advent. Another of the famous Messianic Psalms is Psalm 110, the one that we noted was quoted by Jesus. The Lord, or Yahweh, says to my Lord, which would be the Messiah, "Sit at your right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And it talks about the Lord has sworn he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, the Davidic line could be said to be priests after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is mentioned in Genesis chapter 14. He was both priest and king of Salem, which is short for Jerusalem. David conquered Jerusalem and assumed the royal office of Melchizedek, both his kingly office as well as his priestly office. So all the Davidic kings were priests after the order of Melchizedek in one sense. At one point, David's sons are called priests. But this language seems to be exclusively predictive of Messiah. All the other Messianic Psalms have at least some direct reference to the Davidic king of the day, but this one, arguably at least, is purely predictive of Messiah. I'm following Franz Delitzsch in this interpretation. And so David speaks of him as my Lord, which is not something he would say of a younger contemporary. And he has this royal and priestly function combined. He's both king and Lord, but also priest. And again, the writer of Hebrews picks up on this passage and applies it to Jesus Christ. Psalm 22 is yet another example of one of these Messianic Psalms, although this one's a little different. It's not so much referring to Christ by way of referring to the reigning Davidic king, except insofar as it applies to David, but rather David speaks of himself, but does so in a way that ultimately is fulfilled in Christ. It begins with the line, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words which Jesus uses on the cross, alluding back to this psalm. David is describing his dire situation, but then when he goes on to describe it, he describes it in a way that reminds us of the language about the crucifixion of Christ in the New Testament. I am a worm, but not a man, scorned by mankind, despised by people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in God. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. And yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you I was cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravaging and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaw. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones, and they stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now David here is talking about himself. There's no indication that he's predicting anything in the psalm itself. But what he says about himself seems to be an echo of the crucifixion scene, as Jesus from the cross helped us to see by quoting verse 1 on the cross, quoting the Aramaic of it, by the way, rather than the Hebrew. When he talks about their opening wide their mouths at me, well, that's the crowd that was mocking Jesus as he was crucified. I'm poured out like water. Remember his words, I thirst. All my bones are out of joint. Well, of course, when Jesus hung on the cross, the pressure on the joints would sometimes cause the bones to pop out of the sockets. Dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. Well, that again is what they did when they crucified Jesus, piercing his hands and feet, and dividing my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. This is actually quoted in the gospel accounts of what they did when they crucified Jesus. They divided his clothing, but there was one piece that couldn't be divided, so they cast lots for it. Now again, David seems to be talking about himself, and yet it uses language that in a typological way foreshadows David's greater son Jesus and what would happen to him, and that's why this language is quoted in the New Testament and applied to Christ. So Gunkel would not have called this a messianic psalm, but based on New Testament usage, it is at least what Delitzsch would call a typico-prophetic psalm. So it's referring to David, but it foreshadows what would happen to Christ in a prophetic kind of way. Anyway, that's a messianic psalm. Again, Psalm 18, Psalm 20, Psalm 21, Psalm 45, 72, 101, 110, 132 are messianic psalms, and some have prophetic typology, Psalm 22. And that then concludes our introduction to the genres in the Psalms. Now, some of the Psalms defy categorization. They don't fit into any one of these standard categories, and yet the categories can still be useful for discussion purposes. You can say, well, this isn't a hymn, but these verses have hymn-like features. This isn't really a lament, but this section has a lament-type feature. It isn't really a song of a wisdom psalm, but this part of it looks like a wisdom psalm. So even where it doesn't fit a category, the categories are useful. And that ends our discussion of genres in the Psalms and the